Good afternoon, everybody, and perhaps morning or evening to other people. Welcome to our first panel from certainly from the launch event of the Center for Advancing Safety in Machine Intelligence, CASME. To give you, I'm going to hand this off to the panelists as soon as I possibly can, but I wanted to say, one, welcome. And two, the mission of CASME is to determine the research needed to actually operationalize the evaluation of and the design of artificial intelligence systems that are safe, broadly written. And CASME is a partnership between Underwriters Laboratories that has been looking at issues of safety for 128 years, and Northwestern University, where within computer science in particular, we are squarely aware of the need to look at the technologies we are developing from the point of view of their impact in the world. And we put together a panel for you today to talk about the core issues of safety, ethics, and AI. We have David Danks, who is going to be moderating the panel for us. And I just wanted to say hello and welcome and hand it off to David.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. And it's really an honor to get to be here today as a part of the launch of CASME. It's an incredibly important endeavor that it's really been much needed for a while, and it's great to see you taking a lead on this. So I'm David Danks, professor of data science and philosophy at UC San Diego, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator for today's panel, looking at the whether there are tensions or the perceived tensions that are often noticed between or argued for between ethics and safety on the one hand, values on the over here, and AI and its performance and benefits. And so people say, well, we want to do these things, but we can't because it might be unethical or it might be unsafe. And what we want to really look at as a part of this panel with these three amazing panelists that we have with us today is to really ask if that's right. Is there an inherent fundamental tension between the construction of AI systems and the construction of safe systems, or the construction of AI that helps, machine learning that helps, and ethical machine learning, ethical systems, and really to see and explore the ways in which there might or might not be challenges and tension lurking at this intersection of ethics, safety, and AI, which is of course absolutely critical to the overall message of CASME. So we have three wonderful panelists. We're going to start off with each of them having a few minutes to say a bit about their thought of whether we can have it all, and then we'll move into an extended conversation. I'd like to invite you to use the Q&A feature to drop your questions in there, and we'll see if we can work them into the conversation as we go along. So our first panelist is Yejin Choi, who is the Brett Helzel Professor at the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington, and also a Senior Research Manager at AI2, overseeing Project Mosaic. Her research investigates a wide variety of problems across NLP and AI, including common sense knowledge and reasoning, neuro-language degeneration, language grounding with vision and experience, and AI for social good. She's a co-recipient of the ACL Test of Time Award in 2021, the CVPR Longe Higgins Prize, a Test of Time Award in 2021, a NeurIPS Outstanding Paper Award in 2021, clearly a very good year, AAAI Outstanding Paper Award in 2020, the Borg Early Career Award in 2018, the inaugural Alexa Prize Challenge in 2017, IEEE AI's 10 to Watch in 2016, and the ICCV MAR Prize, the Best Paper Award in 2013. She received her PhD in computer science at Cornell and BS in computer science and engineering at Seoul National University in Korea. So I guess the question is, can we have it all?
Okay, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to have a discussion about this very important challenge we are facing today with AI, ethics, and safety. So I think the corollary to that question is, can we have the following three: ethics, safety, and humanity, especially that we are facing fake news, not less than ever before. And there's still war going on, killing civilians, and inequality is still a thing. I don't know if it's getting any better. It might be getting worse with the structural biases against marginalized groups. So it seems that humanities are still grappling with challenges with ethics and safety. And then here comes AI. So we now have an added challenge to deal with ethics and safety around AI as well. And I think it's fundamentally the challenges that require both more dedicated AI research among AI researchers, but also more external efforts around AI to resolve complicated issues. So internally for AI, probably we do need to think about making AI more robust and ethics and safety aware. But this really challenge becomes question that goes beyond the scope of what AI researchers typically think about. So we really do need to draw from deep insights and expertise from philosophies and social sciences and laws and all these other disciplines, and seek new and truly cross-disciplinary research by joining forces with people in researchers in humanities as well. Personally, so my area of research is more in language and other modalities of intelligence within AI, such as computer vision, and especially focusing on language. Today, the language models trained on large-scale data really lacks the notion of ethics or safety. It really reflects the biases and toxicity that humanities have and reflect into the raw internet data as is. Maybe it's even making things more exaggerated. That's quite possible, but a lot of these challenges come from the raw data that people shared online. So we do need to think about how to address that so that language models are better informed of ethics, equity issues, and toxicity. Part of my research is around that. But again, a lot of unresolved challenges that we are facing today, and I'm very excited to have fruitful discussion here today.
Great, thanks so much. We also are delighted to be joined by Brent Hecht. Dr. Brent Hecht is Director of Applied Science in Microsoft's Experiences and Devices organization, where he's working to increase the scale, pace, and responsibility of innovation within products like Teams, Edge, and Office. Sorry, we're not on Teams today, Brent. He also helped lead the company-wide effort to respond to changing work practices following the onset of the pandemic. Dr. Hecht has an additional appointment as an associate professor at Northwestern University, where he leads the People, Space, and Algorithms Research Group. He's been doing award-winning human-centered AI research for over 10 years, and his work has been particularly influential in the responsible AI domain. He's the recipient of a career award from the US NSF, and his work has received best paper recognition at multiple top-tier publication venues in human-centered AI, such as SIGCHI, CSCW, and Mobile HCI. Dr. Hecht's research has also had an impact in the public sphere, as it's been featured by the New York Times, the Washington Post, MIT Tech Review, the Atlantic, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and other outlets. He was on the founding executive committee for ACM Fact, which is, as many of us will know, the premier publication venue for responsible AI research. And he played a key role in catalyzing the rapidly growing movement to get AI researchers, such as folks at NeurIPS, to more deeply engage with the societal impacts of their work. So Brent, what is your take on that lead question? Can we have it all?
Well, it's interesting to hear that bio said out loud. Definitely is a, I'll use the filter that Zoom has built in to hide my blushing. I have a pretty simple answer. And I would say, hopefully with something that can prompt discussion, I would say yes, as long as we don't let perfect get in the way of the good. So a key point that sort of follows from that is something that I said in every instance of the Algorithms and Society course that I initiated at Northwestern a number of years ago. And that is that you sort of pose this question for the students, right? Say, like, is it likely that the current path in AI is going to lead to the best outcomes for the most people? Probably not. For the other half of the class, I say, is it likely that if we throw out all of our AI, that will lead to the best outcomes for the most people? Probably not. So the answer then is in the very sticky, very complex middle. It means we need to roll up our sleeves and learn a lot. As Eugene was saying, engage in multidisciplinary perspectives, and these types of things. And do the best that we can and celebrate small wins where we have them. And of course, aim towards bigger wins when those are possible. But I'm very optimistic that we can make a lot of progress as long as we don't get too caught up on perfection. Speaking of that, I'll say I want to channel something that Steve Sawyer, who was taught, he's a professor at Syracuse. I was talking to him yesterday, and he put it very well. I said, okay, so how do we navigate the complex middle? Well, one way to do that is to make sure that the folks who come out of the computing, a computing education or computing training, don't think of people as the equivalent of Lego people in their simplicity. And we have to make sure that folks who come out of the social science side of things don't think of AIs as simple as toasters, right? These are real people and really complex systems, and we both need to embrace the complexity of each. And I will stop there.
Great, yeah. Interesting that both of you have already raised these issues of the complexity of humanity and the importance of keeping that completely centered. Our final panelist is Kara Lapointe, who is the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy, certainly something very close to the ideas of safety and machine intelligence, which works to ensure that autonomous systems are safe, secure, and trustworthy as they are increasingly integrated into every aspect of our lives. Kara spent more than 2 decades in the United States Navy, holding numerous roles in areas including autonomous systems, acquisitions, ship design, naval force architecture, and unmanned vehicle technology integration, so very involved in the practice. She was previously a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Beek Center for Social Impact and Innovation, where she created the blockchain ethical design framework as a tool to drive social impact and ethics into blockchain technology, a place that is sorely needed. She served as an advisor to numerous global emerging technology initiatives, including at the UN and the OECD. Dr. Lapointe is a patented engineer, a White House fellow, and a French-American Foundation Young Leader who served under 2 administrations as the interim director of the President's Commission on White House Fellowships. So Kara, your answer to the question.
Thanks, David. And, it's really, thank you so much for being here, because this is such an important topic. And I would say, yes, we can have it all if we're really deliberate about it, right? As both of our other speakers have talked about, this is really about, the complexity of humanity and how it intersects with technology, right? And so when you start to talk about safety and ethics and assurance, all of these issues really live at that intersection between technology and humanity, right? So the way we look at it at the IAA, this Institute for Assured Autonomy that we recently stood up, is we take a really holistic approach. Right? It's not just about technology. It's about technology. It's about those human ecosystems you're going to put that technology into, and it's about ethics and governance. And you have to look at how you have to develop all of those things in concert with one another and really understand the strategic feedback loops between all those different elements in order for us to end up at this result where we can really drive both safety and ethics and trustworthiness into technologies.
Great. So I want to start, if I may, by with a sort of challenge from the peanut gallery, which is one of the things that's crucial when we think about safety is, of course, that values play a key role. what it is to be safe depends in part on the values that we're trying to prioritize, the values we're trying to protect. And here, Yijin, I wanted to come back to your point that in your work on natural language processing, you found that a lot of the text that's out there is perhaps not what we want our systems to learn from. And I'm wondering, the skeptic might say, well, the same is true of values. We shouldn't care what people say they want. Let's not engage with the public because the public doesn't know what really matters to them. And I'm guessing that that skeptical argument is not going to be one you would endorse, but I'm curious, how do we work through the tension of finding the good data about the values that matter for us in our safety, considerations of safety, from the ones that maybe are analogous to hate speech?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really challenging one. And as a researcher who likes to work on inherent biases in human language, I actually found that current movie scripts, novels, stories, it's all wrong, even including textbook. There's a recent study about how even textbook in early on, elementary school education use particular kinds of framing that gives more power to men, basically. I might as well go ahead and say that even for describing slavery, for example, textbook tends to say, the slave owners were sometimes really kind to their slaves. When they were kind, they are mentioned. But when they did awful things, slaves were treated badly. So, the agent disappears out of the sentence. And these are subtle, but these really influence the way people grow up and think about different, people from different backgrounds and racial backgrounds and gender backgrounds and so forth. So who's responsible of finding such data? I think AI researchers naively for some time thought that, it's engineering people's responsibility to figure that out. I'm going to just work on my beautiful ML algorithms and someone else should figure out where nice data comes from. But I think it's really the challenge that we have to work together to address. I do my best what I can do, but I don't think I'm the expert, to decide where to draw boundaries of biases. And I think this will have to be ongoing, hard efforts that require attention from both industry and academia, and both the researchers and engineers, both the AI folks and outside AI folks.
I think that's a great way to think about it in terms of the need to engage with communities, to actually work with them. And that calls to mind when we're trying to identify what are the values that matter for safety. Kara, your point about getting together interdisciplinary teams, collaborative teams across the sort of life cycle of a project. I'm curious, how do we create those teams? I mean, everybody who's done interdisciplinary work knows it's difficult. And so are there things that we can be doing either as educators, as researchers, as members of the public to help make these teams function better or prepare, say, the next generation to be able to function in these teams?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, David. And I think there's a couple layers to that, right? One, there's the teams of the researchers and practitioners, right? How do you break through silos? Because if you think about how we work in different organizations, so often we're siloed, whether you're in an academic environment or even, the importance of kind of crossing the sector silos, right? Working with industry, working with government, working with academia, trying to bust through those silos can be really challenging. But I think you just have to be deliberate about it. Right. There are methodologies to do that. There are different frameworks for how you can, co-propose for funding with somebody from a company and with academia, right, where you can kind of do longitudinal research together. Right. There are consortia where you can bring both government, you can bring industry, you can bring academia together around kind of some of these shared challenges. So I think really understanding the mechanisms we have globally to break through silos is really important. But then beyond the practitioners, there's also this piece of stakeholder engagement, right? I mean, this is so challenging in terms of, where do you find the data, right? How do you get the quality underlying data to understand what we need out of these technologies? What do we value? And what do we need from all the different stakeholders? So I think this is where, especially important is bringing together both the social sciences and the technical and engineering sciences together, because you need to we need more research in terms of how you take the idea of kind of human-centered design to community scale, right? And to society scale. How do you do, say, participatory technology development? Is that the way to go, right? I mean, there's research in that arena. So I think really focusing on how do you bring together both the researchers, the practitioners, the different sectors, but then also specifically, how do you bring the stakeholder voice in? Those are both areas that are really important. And there are models out there, but we have to be deliberate about finding them and using them.
So, that the way you're talking about sort of the models and how to bring things together and the mechanisms calls to mind, Brent, your point about don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But of course, these are really complicated problems. I mean, if I'm trying to work with some students about how do we operationalize safety in a particular context, it's a very hard task. So are there sort of best practices, or at least better practices that can make a difference here? Or is it still at a stage of kind of relying on the intuition of the engineer or the intuition of the philosopher?
It definitely, I'm very much, I mentioned earlier that it's critical to embrace the complexity of both the technical and social challenges, but also make sure the perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good. I think one way to square that circle is to be focused on solutions and less on problem identification. The responsible AI community broadly is way over-indexed on problem identification, and that eventually the society demands that the community come up with solutions, or society will start to lose trust, I think, in the research community, more generally. So, this is adopting certain philosophical frameworks, but ones I think that would be pretty unobjectionable to the vast majority of stakeholders. Find solutions that you can build that help people as quickly as possible and work from there. There's nothing wrong with a highly iterative, low-hanging fruit-based strategy at this stage of the game. You can help people and not wait. So I get a little frustrated when I see massive debates around like which philosophical framework are you using, these types of things. And that's useful. Don't get me wrong, that's definitely useful. It shouldn't be more than a small percentage though of the discussion, right? If we're going to live up to what's various societies expect of us, operationalizing that and quickly, is going to be quite important. So in terms of shortcuts, yeah, I mean, I think that there are a dime a dozen. So like quickest ways to go about things. So, Kara, you mentioned getting people together. So and you're figuring out how to, apply for grants together. Think about where your incentive structures overlap with someone who you need to collaborate with, and just dive in. Don't worry about it too much, just dive in. If you're a computer scientist, you have more money than your social science colleagues. That is the way that the most countries around the world distribute research dollars. So don't just ask your social science colleague, hey, can you help me out with this deep and challenging problem? Even a low-hanging fruit, 1 year, very exciting idea that can make a real difference, but can you do this for free? No, give them some award, just get stuff done along those lines. The other thing I'd recommend too, in terms of finding these solutions, finding the dimes in the dozen, is focusing in very specific domains, right? So like one of the first projects I'm working on with the center is with my former student, Jake Thibault speaker, who might be here now, a distinguished professor at the University of Washington. He's the University of Wisconsin. It's I have a 1-year-old, so it was a rough night last night. Is thinking direct, operationalizing safety. Let's just actually treat it physical safety, right? That's a very easy way to operationalize safety. And we're looking at how we can make routing algorithms less likely to suggest that people go down dangerous roads given weather conditions and these types of things. That's particularly an issue where road networks are not as well developed. It's a very well-structured problem, pretty straightforward to begin to address, and we can make some impact quickly. So as you can tell, I tend to be a very big pragmatist about this, and don't worry, just do is kind of a and it's what I have. Yeah.
Yeah, and David, if I can jump in really quick, just kind of in response, because I think, Brent, you bring up some really, really good points here. And as David pointed out, I spent most of my early career as a practitioner, right, in this realm. And, we had this mantra of you build a little, test a little, learn a lot. So I really do believe in this. You have to jump in, you have to, start coming up with solutions, and you do the, you go after the low-hanging fruit, because it's not just about learning about the problem. It's also about training up people and building that expertise that you have kind of a broad group of folks who can engage. And when we talk about breaking through silos and bringing together people from different backgrounds, that can sound really daunting. It can be as easy as bringing 4 people together in a room and just making sure that they come from different backgrounds and arenas, so that you have not just the technical expertise, but you have the domain expertise and you have the stakeholder voices. Right. And Yejin has pointed out, it's often the marginalized and vulnerable populations that don't have a voice in the process. So the way you bring ethics into this as well is you make sure that you have their voice in the process, right? And there's different ways to do that, but to be deliberate about that, it doesn't have to be really, really hard to at least start to attack some of these problems. You just have to be deliberate.
Yeah, and I definitely want to draw attention also to something that both of you called out, which is the importance not just of building and sending out in the world, but testing and monitoring and watching and learning. That I think often is perhaps what happens sometimes in these deployments that are really problematic, is that people build something, throw it out in the world, and then walk away, rather than using it as an opportunity to learn. And when we think about safety, definitely we want to think about learning through our deployments. Brent gave an example of physical safety. I was wondering, since safety, it's after all in the title of CASME, when you move into the spaces of things like language, how might we think about measuring or testing or tracking safety over time in more linguistic or social domains rather than the physical ones?
Yeah, the evaluation is really an interesting challenge when nothing worked in NLP, which actually was the case maybe a decade ago. I mean, nothing worked is a little bit too drastic, but it wouldn't really draw public attention in the way that it does these days. So in the olden days, we used to have laboratory setting in which we test our AI models, and that was sufficient. It was expert written examples of testing some sort of language capabilities of neural models, machine learning models. Back then, it was not necessarily deep learning. But these days, that's just not enough, because in the laboratory setting, it looks as if neural networks can match human performance or even superhuman level performance. So news media might brag about it, but the reality is that if we deploy such models, then all the bad stuff does come out. And the reason being, the real life scenarios are much more adversarial and diverse and cornery than what's assumed in the laboratory setting. So I think we somehow need to reduce the gap between the laboratory setting and what happens when we deploy something. And part of that direction might be viewing evaluation framework as more evolving and dynamic practice, as opposed to a fixed leaderboard that people climb up without questioning what's in the leaderboard. It might be that there needs to be more publicly facing demo systems that can be stress tested by public at large before formal deployment, because I don't know how else we can really test some of these problems.
David, if I could jump in here quickly and reflect as well. So, Yejin, I love what you said. As someone who, with Darren Gergel, who is on this call, sort of did some of the original research that explored what are now known as representative harms within language models or vision models, or basically how a computer harms and how a computer understands the world. I generally speaking encourage folks to steer away from those these days as a research subject, in part because it's much harder to get towards solutions in that domain. We already know, quite a lot. And so like one thing I reflect on is, okay, so let's say a computer understands the world through the lens of some people with values that maybe a large majority of at least the United States might disagree with, at least in some very small niches of, a large multidimensional. Without getting too technical, in a small set of how the computer understands the world, there are some problematic relationships there. Is that a bigger issue than the fact that the model itself was developed using a vast quantity of human labor in the form of people writing Wikipedia articles, people upvoting things on Reddit, people submitting things to Reddit, more generally people writing things on the internet, and the only people who are benefiting financially from the model are the folks who developed the hardware and the software upon which the model was through which the model was developed? Is that a bigger harm? Is that allocative harm, which is like who's getting the winnings from this innovation, more significant than that representation harm? I would say yes, for sure. And the research community, I think in part because of inertia and some other factors, is much more focused on those representation harms, and the allocative harms is kind of the frog boiling in the water. So yeah, and to me, there's lots of solutions we can think about there too, right? There's policy, we can team with policy folks. Some of my students are working intently on developing tools to help people take collective action, in those types of scenarios, even developing some licenses that allow people to release content online and say, yeah, if you're going to use this for this type of purpose, either you have to give me a seat at the table, stuff along those lines. So yeah, that's in terms of like with language, it's all large scale modeling that relies on large scale data sets. So it's language, vision, whatever. I think some of the representational concerns are much less important than the allocative ones in terms of how the model is actually getting used and who benefits from it.
Well, I think, one of the things that it's interesting to hear the discussion here, because I think it actually connects with one of the questions in the Q&A, and just a reminder to throw your questions in there from the audience, is that a lot of the ways that we describe some of the perhaps more problematic models is in terms of language like unsafe or toxic, which suggests that people are sort of deliberately doing things wrong. But in many cases, of course, quite frankly, it's not malicious intent, it's that people didn't think about things. So it's often failures due to, or problems due to ignorance. So, I'm wondering, is there actually a way that we could think about changing the language here? That, maybe we shouldn't be talking about ethical AI and AI, but rather, AI and bad AI, that you're just bad at the job if you don't think about these things. But now, are we doing a sort of inappropriate expansion of the job, right? If we say this is, part of being a good AI researcher is using the right function, part of being a good AI researcher is engaging with communities, part of being a good AI researcher is thinking about the impacts of what you're building. Kara, I saw you on mute. I'm guessing you have some thoughts. How do we avoid it becoming sort of mission creep, where now we're expecting actually too much of folks?
Yeah, so this is something that actually, my team and I talk a lot about, is that there's these different kind of sides of the coin when you think about ethics and AI. One of them is, how do you take values and ethics and actually operationalize them in AI technologies, right? But the other side, David, is the part that you're bringing out, which is more, I would say kind of this more about the responsible development and deployment and use of AI, right? Are you using kind of whatever quality standards we have? And there aren't, agreed upon industry standards. There are a lot of people who are coming out with kind of responsible AI practices and standards, but, are you using those so that you can avoid those unintended consequences? Right? And how are you using these algorithms? So I think we tend to use ethics and AI, as a shorthand, and all of us look at it and have a different piece of what they're thinking about, but it's helpful to decompose it into the different arenas of it, right? We need to think deliberately about what values are we building into the technology, but we need to think just as much about your point about, are we being responsible just in the development and really understanding what we're doing so that when we go to develop and use it, we really understand what the impacts are going to be. And in my opinion, the metrics you start to look at are less about, you know, how the technology is functioning and more the impacts they're creating, because that's how you can start to capture some of the stuff that you just don't see in the models. Like, what is the impact? Are we creating positive social impact, right? And how do you start to value that in a very technology neutral way, right? You step back from the technology, because one of the problems is that the technology moves so fast. How do you even start to create metrics around what is responsible, what is ethical when the technology is evolving so quickly?
If I may respond to Brent's earlier comment, because that was a really interesting one. Representational harm versus allocational harm. I wouldn't be so sure whether one is immediate, bigger concern than the other, although I agree with you that allocational harm seems a little bit more immediate. But I worry about representational harm still if AI becomes so powerful so that it's really engraved in human lives, day-to-day lives, which we don't know whether it won't happen. So if that does happen, then the implicit biases, which may have been unintentional, even from human side, but that can reinforce stereotypes about, for example, Black people or about women. You know, there's a lot of these assumptions about, for example, women needing to be, women should be nice and soft. Some people truly believe that, and they try to reinforce the stereotypes, which makes it a little bit harder for them to be a CEO, perhaps, or take more powerful positions at the same time. And there may be then, you know, allocational discrepancies resulting from that. It's more implicit and nuanced, but it might be a real challenge. Though I do note that I admit that when I do this line of research, some people argue back that it's all, you know, freedom of speech. It might be that half of the country even thinks that it's freedom of speech. You know, if you say things that's, you know, projecting certain kinds of stereotypes for certain people. So it's an interesting question. I think it becomes more of a subjective topic for sure, but it's hard not to think about it when AI has really powerful capabilities, reinforcing that sort of stereotypes, which closely tied to social structure and equity.
Hey, June, I think you raised an excellent point, and maybe I should expand the logic behind the relationship between allocative harms and representational harms a little bit more. So I, not through intention, but through luck, managed to get training in both the social science and computer science. So my PhD is in computer science. I thought I was going to get a PhD in human geography, which is really a wonderful social science to study if you're interested in responsible AI, because it uses geography as a lens to there's no disciplinary excuse like, oh, that's not geography, you know, like, so I'm not going to study it. If it's spatial and it comes out of sociology or anthropology or whatever, you have to integrate that all together and figure out what it means and how to address any problems that you identify. So from the, you know, with that lens, that, you know, the relationship between allocative and representational harms became, you know, pretty clear to us early. So, and you highlighted them. So effectively, let's think about why it is the case that some people would write, why there's enough people on the internet to write the types of things that you mentioned at a scale that would be impactful to, you know, a large language model or whatnot. And a lot of that goes to the power structures that exist in society, right? It's that, you know, women are increasing their power over the last 50 to 70 years in many countries. And there's a reactive element from men that's pushing back. That's a key dynamic there. And one thing that concerned me about the trajectory of AI is actually, like, broadly, even if these are terrible frames that are completely incorrect, we'll adopt them from the media, even if we have a completely unbiased AI and these types of things with respect to how it understands the world across race and gender, it's still going to make a certain group of people a ton of money and other groups of people perhaps even less money because of automation concerns and these types of things. So the broad hypothesis here is that if we address the allocative concerns, the representational harms will go away because effectively there will be less bias in society for a model to reflect and reinforce. And the flip side of that, I alluded to this earlier, is if we focus only on the representational harms and don't think about the allocative harms, we're going to be constantly fighting against more and more inequality in society, which will show up in our data sets, which will be completely harder and harder to address. And there's some, broader sort of, I would say, moral concerns with that situation, more generally. So you can imagine if an AI paradigm becomes an inequality reducer, you are not only addressing allocative harms, you're also going to address representational harms.
I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, and certainly goes to the reply that often I think is the right one when we see discussions of algorithmic bias and people say, all right, how do I make my model less biased? And sometimes the answer should be, or I would argue should be, go out and make the world less biased.
Yeah,
make the world a better place, and your model is going to be less biased as a result. And there is sometimes a kind of techno-solutionism that can set in of, the only way to do this is by AI.
Yeah, well, I would say within computer science, one way to avoid techno-solutionism is to focus on specifically the technology domain, right? And thinking about what it's doing within society. And AI, that is, as of now, mostly our turf. And if we can make AI a more positive actor in that respect, then given, as Eugene mentioned, and given how powerful it might become in society, that could make a big difference. Yeah, the real risk here is that we become like, when you hear, what's a good example? My wife and I rewatched Dr. Evil. Austin Powers like 2 or 3 years ago, and it was reflecting on how relevant some of the satire still is. Dr. Evil works at like a large tech company, effectively, telecom, I think at the time. And like one of the things that the issue, like, this is a corporation that's pure evil, right? That's the strategic plan of, I can't remember the name of the company, but that you can imagine, but they're going to appoint a board that has 50% women. I worry that our AI systems might get to that point, and we want to make sure that they don't, right? So it's like, yes, they don't say nasty things, but they're causing a lot of nasty harms.
So I guess I'd like to, here, I'm going to sort of put Kara on the spot. I apologize for this, but, you've done a lot of work with the U.S. Department of Defense, with the U.S. Navy. And that's an organization that in certain contexts, actually, safety is not a top priority. I mean, that simply is the reality of it, at least in some sense. I see the look you're giving me already that you want to push back on that. But that's exactly what I wanted to raise, is right, the values and needs of a military organization, for example, might be quite different from the values and needs of a low-income community. So how do we balance the ways in which safety is widely varied across these contexts? You mentioned working with your team and always asking these questions. So I'm guessing that that's going to be a key part of it. But I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how, when you're working on assurance and autonomy in perhaps more defense and security contexts, what is the conception of safety in that kind of a setting?
Yeah. So David, as you know, I spent much of my career within the Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy, and much of that trying to bring autonomous systems in a way that, abided by social norms, ethical frameworks. But safety is, I think, the number one factor that you think about when you think about technology in a military setting. And the reason that in the military you think about it that way is because everything you do, for the most part, is a safety critical system. It's people's lives are on the line, whether these systems work or not. We work in very, very hazardous conditions. I've heard that the most dangerous operating environment in the world is to work on the deck of an aircraft carrier. And I've been there. It's a very, very dangerous environment. So when you bring AI and you bring autonomy into these realms, there's a huge conservatism about bringing in these emerging technologies because safety is critical. But I think that really understanding the domain expertise for the environment of where you're bringing AI, and then AI that acts without human intervention, so autonomy, into those environments is critical. Right. And so we use and are leveraging AI in all domains, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in decisions about healthcare insurance, whether it's in credit decisions, whether it's in cyber physical autonomous systems. You have vehicles operating in different environments. Safety is important in all of those contexts, but safety is going to look different in terms of what the needs are of everybody who's affected by those technologies, which is why I think you have to have a very context dependent approach to coming up to solutions, like Brenna's focusing on. It's about creating solutions, but you have to have the right people at the table to understand what you need out of a solution in any given context.
So I want to pitch a question now to all three of you. I'll let you, we'll see who wants to jump in on this one, because I think this focus on solution and actually figuring out what we mean in the world. How do we test for this? How do we measure? How do we know that we've found an answer? I think it certainly is at the heart of what CASME is trying to do, and hence the connection with Underwriters Laboratories. But let me pose what is perhaps the challenge, the giant elephant in the room we haven't really discussed, which is value or safety pluralism, which is systems, what I think is safe may not be what you think is safe. And so when we're trying to get to actual operational solutions, how do we reconcile this pluralism? Because we have to make a decision. We've got to make a call, either trading off different values or doing a weighted average or prioritizing certain individuals. So in your work, in your experiences, how do you tackle this, sort of ubiquitous and persistent problem that what it is to be safe is perhaps going to depend at least a little bit on who you're asking?
David, I'll jump in here and say that I'll echo or channel my pragmatism and solutions focus here and say that it's an important question you're asking, but I think it applies to a small minority of at least near-term cases. So take, for instance, physical safety. Let's say 98 to 99% of people would say that we want to increase physical safety in any AI system. And I use that 98% or 99% threshold intentionally because I was having a fascinating conversation with one of the people who put together the ACM Code of Ethics, so the Code of Ethics for the largest scholarly professional society in computing. And they used specifically a 98% threshold. And the reason for statements that the community agrees with, and the reason they chose that threshold was 2% in a survey they did 2% of respondents said that they didn't think computing professionals needed to be honest. So and so I said, oh, you've effectively found your, contrarian cohorts, 2%. Yeah, it's like, yeah, in like a, in a postmodernist sense, sure. Like we can talk this through, and like there are, like edge cases where obviously that might break down, but, broadly speaking, 98% said, yeah, that seems to be a reasonable thing to put in the Code of Ethics. And I think we can sort of use that with regards to safety and get pretty far before we run into some of these sticky cases. Another analogy might be drawn to the Supreme Court. And, we pay a lot of attention to the things that get fought out in the Supreme Court. But the vast majority of even policy fights that go through the legal channels get resolved either in state courts or well before it hits the Supreme Court. So that's kind of, I think, where we can start. And again, I think physical safety is a great example, but there are some other ones. There are some other ones too. Like for instance, Eugene, you mentioned free speech, but I can tell you this for sure that the vast majority of companies in the world do not want their any text generated by any system that they use or that they developed to say very racist or very sexist things. I think we can just make that assumption. And if people disagree with it, okay, have fun in the contrarian caucus. That's fine. We'll keep on moving forward. We're not going to spend too much time worrying about the epistemological debate that you're raising.
But I'd like to push back a little bit, Brent, that kind of this pluralism of perspectives on safety is not important, because I do think it's important. Even the example you bring up about physical safety. So where I am, we work a lot on critical infrastructure systems. So 98%, isn't actually going to be the right standard for a lot of those systems. You're going to need something that's much higher. So even though it sounds like a small percentage, the difference of getting from 98% to 99 point, some certain nines afterwards can be very challenging technically. Right. And so it's important in those contexts. But then even the broader picture in terms of some of the impact of other types of not even physical systems, but some of these decision algorithms that we have, look at from a governance perspective of how we're looking at AI and AI-enabled systems, look at kind of a European perspective in terms of what's the most important, and some of the algorithmic accountability regulation that has come out, some of the privacy regulations versus a view that you might have in the US. And it feels like sometimes there's subtle differences, but those subtle differences can have huge impact on how you're developing technology. So I do think that pluralism is important, and that's why you need that link to one, social sciences, and two, to participatory engagement methodologies, so that you can capture that and understand where it is important and where it is less important.
Yeah, Kara, I think that's a great point. One is I'd say, actually, I wasn't speaking in terms of accuracy, just speaking of in terms of general agreement. And one way to cast sticky problems into something where there's general agreement is to say, okay, well, we don't agree on this. Can we agree on a process? Yeah, 98% of people, at least within the United States, say that if you increase the democracy in the process through things like stakeholder engagement or more democratic governance of any decisions associated with data AI technologies, that you have total agreement, you have maybe hit that 98% threshold or something close to it, and then you can go through that route, right? So it's not necessarily the decision in the technology itself, it is the decisions in the process and the outcomes of the technologies too. But if you can get to I'm just very optimistic there's tons of low-hanging fruit that sits around that 98% threshold if we pay attention to it. The 2% is fun to think about because it does challenge the meaning of what good is, and the meaning of what an algorithm is, and all these types of things. But as scholars need to be really focusing on the things that affect people's lives in this domain at this point, I think, for the most part.
Yeah, if I may, a little bit to that. By the way, I appreciate how Brent, takes more somewhat more extreme position, which makes the discussion or debate more fun.
It's a little bit.
Yeah, and it's very thought-provoking. Though I agree with you, by the way. So I recently built Delphi, an online demo that people can ask some morally implied situations and then see what the system might say. In building that, I had a similar thought about moral or value pluralism and how far do I actually want to respect that. And, I felt that when it comes to abortion, initially I was having almost knee-jerk reaction because I have my position and I felt uncomfortable when the system is vague about it. But then I was thinking maybe this is somewhat more acceptable. So Delphi is very left, by the way, or more leaning toward left. And I thought that, well, maybe I shouldn't really try to project my own political viewpoint into the system and try to be more reflective of other viewpoints. But when it comes to whether there was Holocaust or not, okay, that's too far. And I decided that, just categorically, it's wrong to deny Holocaust. So I'm pretty happy to ignore whatever percentage that people might be who denies that. But for other cases, it does seem to be that there are some pluralism cases that are good to reflect, even down to cultural differences. Is it okay to wear shoes inside your house or not? And, due to climate change, should we all be vegan or is it okay to eat cows? And I mean, should we all convert conferences to virtual now? And these become thorny. And while we try to figure out whether where to draw boundaries to support certain viewpoints, from AI perspective, we can definitely work on algorithms that can better address, more interactively, better address people's dynamic viewpoints, or even changing viewpoints. Some people change their mind as time goes on. And so I do think that algorithm does need a new kinds of development, such that it can represent and support different viewpoints, and B, people can easily interact with the system to change its behavior to better suit their needs, and so that they feel more safe to interact with the machine.
And I think a really visceral example of what you're talking about is, you think about when the TSA came up with the body scanners, and at first the body scanners had a very, clear image of what was under your clothes when you went through. And some people would say, oh, well, security is so much more important than privacy. But not everybody would agree with it. Like, that's a pluralism that you have to balance. So the technological solution there would say, okay, well, we're going to add a filter that then you actually kind of preserve privacy while also ensuring safety and security. So I think that's kind of the example of where these types of pluralisms are important, and it's important to acknowledge them. But then there are ways to come up with solutions that can, preserve both of these values for us.
Yeah, and I think you both raised excellent points. And actually, Kara, you kind of pointed to, I think where you land is exactly where I suggest we land. Let's not have a debate about whether privacy or security is more important. Let's figure out how we might get a lot of both. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a pretty darn good solution. And I get occasionally quite worried that society is going to lose trust in the research community to figure out how to make AI positives, to make AI have a net positive impact. And I think we need to focus more of our effort on trying to find an imperfect but good thing that maintains privacy and security, rather than sort of debating between is privacy or security more important. Yeah.
Well, the 49% of my brain that sits in a philosophy department actually loves this conversation, but we are coming to the end of this panel. So I want to ask one last question, and I'm going to ask it and then give you a few minutes, give you a brief period to figure out what your answer might be. I'm not going to immediately call on you, but the question is, the title of the panel was Ethics, Safety, and AI, Can We Have It All? And I think, you've presented really compelling ideas that we can actually have, if not it all, a lot more than people might think. But I want to close with giving you the opportunity to answer the question, ethics, safety, and AI, what's the biggest open challenge or question that we face? While you're having a moment to think about that, I want to thank everybody who's been able to attend this opening launch event of the Center to Advance Safety and Machine Intelligence, CASME. It is an exceptional new center that I know many of us are going to be watching very closely to see what wonderful things come from CASME in the very near future. So thank you for joining us, and I'll let Yejin, then Brent, then Kara close us out. You're muted still.
The biggest challenge, that's difficult for me to pinpoint. I feel like I'm still learning. So for me, the biggest challenge is that I still feel like I have a lot to learn about the scope of the challenge. I personally am maybe slightly less optimistic than the others, in the sense that we are trying to make bad system less worse, as opposed to, yeah, we can really have it all. But we will have to struggle to make things less bad is probably my position at the moment. But maybe there was a little bit of a related question from the QA panel that I see, which is about, is AI having the role of changing the existing world versus properly reflect the existing world? And I think the existing world also is problematic in some ways, in many ways, in terms of safety and ethics. Like I mentioned earlier, that there's a fake news, so there's a war going on, there's inequality. So the question is it okay not to take action, just taking an inaction? Is that doing no harm? Or is that bystander thing actually doing harm by doing nothing? So I think we should try to do something, even if imperfect. So in this regard, I agree with Brent that it's good to do something good as opposed to nothing, even if imperfect.
So I have two answers. One is to change the incentive structures within the field such that we are forced to internalize what we now consider to be externalities. So when something really bad happens, that we take a hit from that, and something really good happens with regards to the impact on society, that we receive those benefits. And that was some of the work I'm thinking about at a sort of a research community scale. And the second is the allocative harms question that I was raising earlier. Can we make sure that AI is not a contributor to, and hopefully is a benefactor of reduced inequality, such that some of the representational harms in the power structures in society, address themselves. Those are the two big challenges I'm thinking about.
And I would say I agree wholeheartedly with both the other panelists. And somebody once said to me, digitizing an analog problem does not solve your underlying analog problem.
Yeah.
Right. So, I really do fear that if we're not deliberate, we will codify and amplify negative impacts of these technologies. So to me, the solution, I agree with the incentivization structures, but it's also being deliberate about understanding kind of the underlying data that's going into these systems and how we can use data and software and hardware in concert to really end up at the impact that we need.
Thank you for those tremendous thoughts. It's been a wonderful hour, and I'm only sorry that we have to end it now. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone who has attended. Best of luck, and please stay safe.